I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
But Germans must find a politician to replace Angela Merkel. After 16 years dominating German and global politics, she's standing down. The world is losing its most powerful woman, and Germans are bracing.
This weekend, Germans will cast their votes for a new government. And for the first time in 16 years, Angela Merkel's name won't be on the ballot. The Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Green Party all have a shot at the Chancellor's office. But can anyone alter Germany and Europe's trajectory after 16 years under Merkel? Joining me today to explain it all is my colleague Judy Dempsey, the editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe. We'll unpack Merkel's legacy and what's next for Germany and Europe. Here we go. Judy, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be honored.
I know you're a longtime participant on the show, but for listeners who are new, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm based in Berlin. I've been here for several years. In fact, I came just before Angela Merkel was first elected Chancellor in 2005. I was following her very closely before that. And since then, I've been following German politics, East European politics, and Russian politics with the perspective from Berlin. And over nearly 10 years now, I've been editor of the Strategic Europe blog, which is under the umbrella of Carnegie Europe.
Everyone should go check out Strategic Europe. It's a great place for really insightful content on European politics and foreign policy. Okay, Judy, a lot of our listeners are American. Can you just walk us through how the German electoral system works? Because it's certainly different than what we're used to.
The German electoral system is actually rather democratic and rather complex. And as you can gather, Germany is a rather complicated country. So essentially, when I go to the ballot on Sunday, I will be given a list of who do I want to see in the next German parliament. And I tick them off 1 to 10. But you're only allowed, 1 to 10. And then there's this for the personalities. And then there's a list for the individual parties. And essentially, you can mix. You can mix your preferences, who you want to be Chancellor on the one hand, and who actually you want to be in your local parliament as well. So it's very interesting. It does give the voter quite a lot of choices rather than just one blanket choice. And that's it's quite good because people do have to read the political programs.
Okay, so there are 3 candidates in the race likely to succeed Merkel as Chancellor. Can you just tell us briefly about all 3?
The main contender, he's running ahead in the opinion polls, is a man called Olaf Scholz. He comes from Hamburg. He's representing the Social Democratic Party. He's actually the finance minister and served with Angela Merkel over the last term. He's affable. He's very articulate and extremely calm. He's got quite a blemished record in the finance ministry, but he's doing very, very well because of his particular slogan, respect for people. Coming up close behind, we've got to watch him because he's creeping up after a miserable performance in the opinion polls, is a man called Armin Laschet. And Laschet is the premier of Germany's most a state called North Rhine-Westphalia. It is such an important state. It's very powerful, it's very rich, and it's very interesting. And Laschet was Angela Merkel's favorite to succeed her. He's dull. He never gives a proper opinion. He's not particularly go-ahead. And he doesn't push for modernizing Germany. But we have to decide at the end of the day if the Germans really do want change. And the third candidate, a very interesting one, she's made lots of blunders throughout the campaign, is Annalena Baerbock, very interesting in her early 40s, leading the Green campaign. Super ideas, huge youth following, a slightly misogynist media against her. She has very interesting ideas on climate change, on digitization, and on European integration. So these are the 3 candidates. Her popularity has fallen for many, many reasons. But I think I can say safely that the Greens will be in the next government.
Okay, so I want to dive in a little bit more on each of the candidates. And I'm going to go out of order from what you said because the Christian Democratic Party has been the dominant force in German politics. So I want to start with Armin Laschet. this is the guy who there have been headlines that said it's his race to lose and he might actually do it. If he does, in fact, not become the next chancellor, it would be only the fourth loss for this party since 1950 in this type of race. So, I mean, why can't this guy win the big one? What is it that Germans don't like about him?
The Germans, I suppose, don't like him because of the other two contenders, especially the Social Democratic contender. Just the first thing. Secondly, the Germans seem to be tired of the Christian Democrats. And after 16 years of Merkelism, and she sort of represented the Christian Democrats, I think they do want change. But the problem is the Germans really don't know what Laschet stands for. And the final point is that, like many, many countries across Europe, the two big bloc parties which emerged after World War II, they're now weakening because the decline of the church, decline of trade unions, decline of sports associations, decline of these groups that kept people all together in these two ideological blocs. And we are seeing the fragmentation of German politics, and Laschet is one of the victims of this.
Okay, so let's talk about Olaf Scholz. A few months ago, Social Democrats were trailing not only behind CDU, but also behind the Green Party. And now you've just said that he's in a good position and likely to win the election. So you said he's affable. What is that all that's driving his resurgence, or what's going on with his lead in this poll and his likelihood to be chancellor?
Scholz has managed to come up through the polls because he has silenced the other leaders inside the Social Democratic Party. And the top leadership of the Social Democrats are frankly a disaster. Not only are they uncharismatic, they have no ideas, and they're very much to the left, which a lot of the old Social Democrats really don't like. But they don't represent this kind of modernizing Social Democratic Party that Scholz represents. That's the first thing. Secondly, there was an agreement inside the party that they would remain silent, out of the picture, and hand it over to Scholz. And at the beginning, Scholz was just so uncharismatic. But you know what? I think it's paid off. He was asked why he didn't have a sense of humor during the campaign. And he says, I'm not in a circus, you know. I'm here to try to be the Chancellor of Germany. And very important, he's sort of homed in on something quite particular, and he never changes the message, and it is respect. And because of the corona crisis, when a lot of very poorly paid people looking after the elderly, nurses, security people and so on, they were very badly paid. They were never thanked. Now they are. And he's reached out to them and said, we've got to have respect for all these people. We have to have a kind of inclusive respect. And what they also like about him is he wants a minimum wage. The minimum wage is only about €10.80 here. It's lower than the US, if I'm not mistaken. And he wants to bring it up to over €12 an hour. This is the resonance. And it's tapped into this kind of the social element, which Laschet doesn't play into at all.
So you're describing a polity in Germany that may be shifting left, but there is a candidate even to the left of the Social Democrats and Olaf Scholz, and that's Annalena Baerbock, the Green Party candidate. There was a brief moment, and you mentioned this, when she was leading in the polls ahead of both Laschet and Scholz, but since she's fallen back, obviously you mentioned misogyny. We're familiar with that here. If you remember the 2016 election of Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, they face that all the time. So we certainly understand that. Okay, so the Green Party, they're going to be part of the government, probably, even if they don't get the chancellorship. So tell us how Baerbock might be changing or reflecting a change in German politics, and what's driving that? Is it youth? Is it climate?
And just let me pick you up on one thing. I'm not so sure the Greens can be described as left-wing. I think they are centrist, but they're bringing in something new to this German election, and it's a kind of modernization of the debate, modernization of the issues. And this is very important. Secondly, she's made climate change number one. The real problem in selling the climate issue is that the public perception is that, if we protect the climate, it's going to cost us money. We won't be able to we won't be allowed to do this. We won't be able to drive our cars. We have to ride our bicycles at a certain tempo. And there's the perception that the Greens are a kind of nanny party. They tell you what's forbidden and what you have to do. And Baerbock's huge challenge was to shake off this image of this party that tells you that you have to behave like this. I think she's managed this, firstly. Secondly, I think the public do like how she's explained the climate issue because she's reached out to industry and the kind of business community. That's been very, very successful. Curiously, the business and the industry lobbies are behind her. This is a big, big plus. And third thing, and we must never underestimate it, the young people are so pro-European. And they want more integration, they want a stronger Europe, and they want a more competitive, outgoing Europe. And Baerbock has tapped into this as well. But somehow this doesn't get mentioned in the big television debates.
So one party we haven't talked about, thankfully, is AfD, the far-right party, which at times in the previous years has surged in popularity, especially in the East. There's been fear over the years of the growth of far-right populism in general in Germany and the United States, certainly with Trump, and in other places, France. But since AfD is not being mentioned, has that threat abated in Germany, or is Germany unique in the world in avoiding this?
On the contrary, in the last couple of television debates with Laschet, Scholz and Baerbock, Armin Laschet was repeatedly asked, if you do become Chancellor, would you have any kind of coalition or kind of cooperation with the AfD? And he said, no, no, no. But at the end of the day, the AfD, they may come in with 10 or 12%. They're already in the German parliament. But they will do well in some of the eastern states, but of course they will never enter the coalition, and it would be extraordinarily damaging for Germany if there was even any consideration that any political party would actually form a coalition with them. But we cannot rule them out. They're going to suck in some votes and to take votes away from the CDU.
So no matter who wins this election, this is obviously a pivotal moment for Germany. There's a lot going on. Without sort of limiting you too much, I'm wondering if you can tell us what the 2 or 3 biggest challenges that the next chancellor will face. Is it immigration, refugees, climate, Europe?
The next chancellor will face 2-3 main issues. A commitment to actually reducing the climate change. This is just so important. But this means actually implementing what the German government has promised, reducing CO2 emissions, but actually pushing this agenda on the European level and much more aggressively. The second issue, which any chancellor will have to deal with, is actually the future of Europe in terms of its integration. Should it be closer together or should it be looser? What are we going to do with a common taxation policy, tighter fiscal arrangements? This cannot be put off for much longer. And the third issue, which I think is very important and it doesn't get any play here, is our relations with the United States on the one hand, and what kind of strategy we're going to have with China. These are the 2 big foreign policy issues.
So we're a foreign policy podcast. I have to ask you, which of the 3 candidates for the chancellorship have articulated the best and clearest vision for a German foreign policy?
I think the Greens have articulated the clearest foreign policy, and it's based on realism, but it's based also on values, combining values with interests. And when it comes to Russia and when it comes to China, the Greens have said that they are against, for instance, this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. But since it's going to go ahead, they need special conditions that Russia will not use gas as a political instrument. On China, they want a much more strategic policy towards China. And neither the Social Democrats nor the Christian Democrats have actually articulated what kind of relationship they do want with China. This is very interesting when the Greens take a stance on this, because this would chime actually with the United States. They are much more, how will I say it, aggressive and openly critical of what China is doing. And somehow this is music to the ears of the Biden administration.
Okay, so you mentioned Russia just now in your answer. Obviously, they have a huge stake in the outcome of this election because of the nature of the relationship they have with Germany. Are there concerns about Russian attempts to disrupt the election or evidence of disinformation campaigns?
The disinformation campaign is absolutely huge. It's huge in the RT, this Russian television. It's huge in social media. It's huge in the trolls. It's huge in the cybersecurity. And the secret services here have warned about this. It is absolutely pervasive and insidious. And the Chinese are doing their own bit as well on disinformation. And so I'm not so sure that the political parties are actually speaking out openly about this and using social media in a much more positive and creative way to actually deal with this disinformation campaign. But it's there, and Russia really went on the offensive against the Greens because of their stance towards Russia and Nord Stream. This is the thing we really have to be worried about.
So you mentioned that the Russians obviously are against Anna Baerbock and the Greens because of their stance on the Nord Stream. Is there a candidate they prefer, or are they mostly just interested in chaos?
They'd be quite comfortable with either the Social Democrats in the Chancellery or the Christian Democrats. But the issue is the constellation of the coalition. And if the Greens were in there, clearly Moscow wouldn't like this, but the Greens would fight very hard to try to get the foreign ministry, but also fight hard for their values and standing up to what Russia is doing. But there's no doubt that the Kremlin would be happy with Armin Laschet or Olaf Scholz.
When we come back, I'll ask Judy about the legacy of Angela Merkel and the future of the U.S.-German bilateral relationship. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. From my perspective, Angela Merkel seems like the leader of Europe and in many ways the de facto leader of the EU. But you've recently argued that she hasn't been boldly leading either Germany or the European Union, and mostly avoiding tough questions that will decide the direction of Europe's future. Could you tell us a little bit about your perspective on that?
Yes. I wrote these things against the background of the enormous complexity of European politics. And Angela Merkel came into power when there was a weak French president. And in all her years in power, we have seen the huge mess up over Britain leaving the EU, which was a huge personal catastrophe for Angela Merkel and for Germany. We have seen how Merkel had to deal with the euro crisis. We've seen how Merkel had to deal with the pandemic, all sorts of issues. And somehow what was needed was a stable leader who wasn't flappable, who represented careful continuity, and who didn't take huge radical decisions based on upsetting risk. And in some ways, Merkel personified the kind of leader that Europe wanted. London was very weak, Paris was very weak, and also Merkel really didn't respond to the kind of Europe that President Emmanuel Macron wanted. So I think with all these crises, from the psychological point of view, there was enough upheaval. And here you had a leader called Angela Merkel who tried to keep the ship very steady. And keeping the ship steady meant saving the Eurozone, keeping Europe together.
So Yasha Monk of The Atlantic wrote a piece about Merkel in which he said the following. Under Merkel, Germany has deepened its economic ties with China, pressed ahead with a gas pipeline that was important to the Kremlin, empowered budding autocrats in Poland and Hungary, and struck immoral deals with dictators in Turkey and elsewhere. I think he's talking about refugees. Is this a fair analysis? This is pretty tough.
If you break it all down, Merkel has shifted her stance from values to interests. And Merkel made values the kind of core of her first term. It was very, very important for her, and she got an awful lot of praise for doing this. And over the years, we have seen Merkel increasingly trying to balance values with interests, and especially when it comes to Poland and Hungary. And I think the criticism is actually legitimate. Merkel could have been much more outspoken about the erosion of the rule of law in Poland and the independent judiciary and press freedom. She could have been much more outspoken about the corruption, what is happening in Hungary with non-governmental organizations, and with the whole creeping authoritarianism led by Fidesz and its Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. She could have been much more critical of the unending corruption in Bulgaria and Romania. And while she may do some of the criticism privately with these leaders, she's never, ever taken this public stance which was actually needed. And it has been a puzzle why she didn't do that.
So as time marches forward and leaders recede into history, they often get boiled down into incredibly small descriptions, right? I'll give you an example in the US context. If you talk about Lyndon B. Johnson, you say civil rights Vietnam, right? I mean, it's 3 words. In sort of the future, when we talk about Merkel, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think she'll be remembered for?
She will be remembered for getting rid of nuclear energy, but not putting in a sustainable, renewable energy infrastructure. She will be remembered for keeping Europe stable and indeed keeping the transatlantic relationship stable, which was very, very important. She had a very good relationship in the end with Obama. And despite the years of Trump, she kept the doors open for protecting multilateralism. I must say that I think Merkel could have done more for underpinning multilateralism and the whole institutions. The third thing, if you look back and you say, Angela Merkel, what did she really do? I think she personified something very deep in the German outlook. Not flamboyant, a safe pair of hands, somebody that guided this very big, powerful country and Europe through all these crises. Some say, oh, that's not enough. She could have been much more radical, much more pro-risk. But was Europe ready for this with all these crises? And although I'm critical of her tenure, and some of it is very ambiguous, I think in some ways, looking back, despite all the criticism, this leader who led Germany and Europe represented a safe pair of hands, and so far has got Europe out of all these crises. Getting out of a crisis, however, is no substitute for coming up with strategy. And this is one of Angela Merkel's, I think, big weaknesses. She has never acted or thought strategically.
So Merkel leaves a complicated legacy behind in Europe. We have to look forward a little bit. Who's going to take the mantle of leading the European bloc? Is it going to be Scholz if he's the next chancellor? Is it going to be Emmanuel Macron, someone else?
No matter what happens, and Europe is going through a very strange phase now, given how the Biden administration has seriously shifted towards the Indo-Pacific region. We are going to need leaders, and I think it'll have to come from Germany with France, who decide what kind of European security and defense policy they want with the United States. No European leader, especially the German and French, can say we can go it alone without the United States. If we go alone if we go it alone and just disregard the transatlantic relationship, the European Union will actually disintegrate.
So it's good that you mentioned the U.S. because I want to transition to that. Obviously, we're recording this in the midst of a very difficult situation between the United States and France over the recently announced submarine deal with the Australians. Obviously, the concept that Biden said America is back is certainly being tested in the minds of Europeans. So how does a post-Merkel Germany think about its relationship with the United States? Do all 3 candidates sort of share a view, or are we bound to see friction based on who might win? Tell us a little bit about the future of the relationship between Biden and the next chancellor in Germany and the United States.
Biden has already done the German government a big favor by not imposing sanctions because of Nord Stream. So in fact, Germany owes the Biden administration one or two thank you presents for this. But in the bigger picture, you have to see a kind of anti-Americanism taking hold in parts of Germany and in parts of Europe. So any future German leader will have to be very, very careful to temper this. Secondly, any future German leader will have to explain why the United States is so important for European security. And no doubt some political parties who won't go into the coalition say, we don't need NATO, you need the United States, we can do our own security. Europe collectively cannot do its own security because at the end of the day, the member states don't trust each other. This is so crucial to understanding the European Union. The member states don't trust each other. France isn't trusted by the Central Europeans. Germany is ambiguously trusted by the Central Europeans. Britain is out of the picture now. Dutch have their own agenda. Italy has its own interests. We all have our own interests and different threat perceptions. So any new leader who enters the German chancellery will have to juggle all of these things. But at the end of the day, if we don't try to forge a new kind of understanding with the United States, we can close down the shop of the European Union.
So you mentioned Nord Stream 2. I want to ask you about the candidates in Germany's position on a couple issues of vital importance to the United States. One is Nord Stream 2. So will that project go forward almost no matter what? And is it settled now?
The matter is going to go forward. It's more or less settled. It's more or less completed. And given the huge energy prices here in Europe, we need energy supplies, but cheap energy supplies. And if Russia uses energy as a political instrument, then let us test the German government and the United States administration, because they promised that if it was ever used as a political instrument, Russia would not get away with this. But at the end of the day, it cannot be stopped. It is there.
Okay, my second question is, and this came up a lot during the Trump administration, but has been brought up by Obama and Biden. Obviously, the European states aren't really meeting their commitments in terms of defense spending. And you mentioned how it'll be really hard for them to pursue what Macron talks about, strategic autonomy, because of their different threat perceptions. Totally makes sense. But how do the German candidates think about the German military and their interest in spending that 2% and building out German security apparatus?
They studiously avoided this issue. This 2% defense spending of gross domestic product, nobody wanted to bring it up because of the idea of military spending. There's a part of the left wing in the Green Party and in the Social Democratic Party that don't want this issue of defense spending. We spend enough in defense and we don't want any more money on this. So this is a very touchy issue. If the Christian Democrats won, I think they would push ahead with the defense. But at the end of the day, when you're Chancellor of Germany, you actually become much more pragmatic. There's no doubt about this. Also, I wonder, is the 2% really the issue to deal with now? Surely the issue is much more cooperation, much more burden sharing. And if you put everything down to how many euros are spent, I think this becomes money spent just to tick off the boxes rather than on value.
Though he would never say so, I'm wondering if you think that Joe Biden has a preference on who wins this election.
This is very difficult. I think the administration would be very pleased if the Greens were in the coalition. They are Atlanticist. They are pro-NATO. They want a firm, united policy over China and Russia. They won't get the top job, but if they're in coalition, this would please the administration. Who would become Chancellor, whether it was Laschet or Scholz? I know President Macron probably would like Scholz because of his views on Europe, but perhaps the administration might be more comfortable with Scholz in the Chancellery.
Okay, I recently had a reporter ask me this question, and they said, now that Merkel is gone, who does Biden call when he wants to get in touch with Europe? And I told him that he should ask this question to you. So if he did ask it, how did you answer him?
It's going to remain Berlin. I have no doubt about this. Trump really didn't know the telephone calls, and he really wasn't interested, and he was really critical of Angela Merkel in Germany. But the Biden administration has that hotline to Berlin.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you should go read Strategic Europe. It's the best blog out there for understanding European politics, foreign policy. Judy writes on it regularly. She also has lots of guests. We'll put a link in the show notes. Go read Strategic Europe. It'll make you smarter. Judy, thanks so much for coming on the show and explaining all of this to us.
Big pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.